Good morning, Paul.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Alberta Links to Learning session for this morning. We have today our guest speakers. And before we get into that, I'm just going to mention that, today is the last in the winter series of the Alberta Links to Learning. We still have this afternoon's presentation, and then Thursday and on Thursday morning and Thursday afternoon. Um, with that being said, hold on, I'm just trying to um, we have I welcome everybody to join in on the spring series that is going to start on April 6th to 8th, and let your peers know, let your colleagues know, let people out there know. I welcome you here today. It's a nice sunny day. I noticed that there's snow out on my deck just outside my office, but when I left my home, there was no snow. So I don't know what's going on in Calgary, but apparently I live in, the best part of it because it didn't snow. So I just wish everybody, good day, and we'll come back when we're done. And today's presentation, I'd like to I'll also remind you to ask questions, to mute yourself, and to also use the chat box if you have any questions. I will go through the chat box, and I will read out any questions that are in there. But I welcome you today to coming together virtually, Zoom 101. And we have Mark Salter, who has been with us before a few times to present at these, or in the fall series and the winter series. And I imagine he'll be back for the spring series. Wealth of knowledge. Thank you, Mark. So we have Mark, who's joined Carden Consulting in the summer of 2017 as a business and life partner with Laura. Mark worked with the Songhees Nation, I hope I didn't butcher that, to achieve their goals of developing successful intergovernmental partnerships, and has worked with First Nations in Ontario and gained more than 10 years experience working with and for First Nations. Mark's has a deep level of respect for First Nation and possesses wide variety of skills that has helped him to develop intergovernmental partnerships, example, Justice Institute, conflict resolution, mediation program, and has been recognized by the Capital Region District and Governor General for environmental leadership, benefiting the regions of Southern Vancouver Island. And thank you, Mark, for, being here today. And today he's with Justin, and I'll just let Justin give a brief introduction of himself.
Good morning. My name is Justin Chrones. I've also been working with Carden Consulting. I have been working with them for about 2 years now. My position ranges quite a bit today, but mainly it's going to be helping introduce Zoom and other technologies in a way that makes sense to us as First Nations people.
Thank you, Justin. So with that, Mark, and if you want to go start your presentation, we
Sure.
can get going.
Aishka OCM Nishkwilika. We're coming to you today from the Slaletoth territory here in Burrard Inlet in around Vancouver, and we'll just slip into our presentation now. I'll let Justin take the lead.
There we are. So, thank you very much for joining us early on a Tuesday morning. I'm sure everyone has coffee and such with them, or at least I'm hoping you do. Today, we're going to be covering a big, wide range of topics. And seeing as how we've already very kindly been introduced, thank you very, very much. I'm going to let Mark give a brief descriptor on what he's been working with.
Welcome, and we greatly acknowledge that we live and play on the Squamish, Slaletoth, and Musqueam territories here in the Burrard. We approach our strength-based methods of support, leadership training, the work we do. This PowerPoint and workshop recordings will be reviewed for the future. Continue to build your leadership skills and capacity as you lead your communities from a remote location. And that's what Justin has focused on in this presentation. And we'll go cue Justin's picture now. And there he is.
And just as Mark said, we at Cardin Consulting live around BC, respecting all the nations that we work with and live within. For me personally, a lot of the background for our work has been production of government policies, communications, IT backend, and also helping them connect in a way that they haven't done before, both with their traditional governance and their heritage in the way that they connect with their members. Today, specifically, we're going to be covering a lot of stuff. So today we're going to be going into what is remote conferencing software, the idea behind it and how it came to be, equipment and how to use it, everything from a webcam to a microphone to a flying carpet. We are also going to be going into procedures that should happen before a meeting takes place, things to keep in mind as you're going through a presentation, a little bit of a coffee break just in case you need cookies after a meeting is over, and how the audience generally tends to receive a closing. Any technical things that might need to be covered, and a closing Q&A. And those last two do blend together quite a lot. That's included my several more years than I care to remember, actually, of work in IT, soft coding, community management, all those things that make me a good person to be here with Mark and help present all of these things. And I'm sure there will be someone with a question of, I've had this break before, or I've had this happen, and that's why I'm here. So I would like to get straight into it by talking about why this whole presentation exists, why we need to even think about this in the first place. Because traditionally, our communities don't have a long-standing history with Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Skype or many programs at all, seeing as how we didn't exactly have IT centers in our longhouses. And that's not something to fear. We have a lot to gain from all of the... We have a lot to gain from all of this technology that's coming around. It allows us to connect with a population that otherwise hasn't seen a lot of representation, either because of their remoteness to their community or because of their inaccessibility to internet or phone lines being a big one. So this enables us to connect with people who, especially in a time of a pandemic of historic proportions, might not otherwise be able to attend a community meeting or an engagement session about governance policies and election code, things that really matter in communities as tightly woven as our Indigenous ones are. Mark, if you'd like to read that.
Yeah, and we have to have we have the opportunity to support all members of our communities, no matter how remote and isolated they may feel, and to come together and to hear more closely to traditional practices and teachings. And as Justin alluded to, well, we've done some recent work with communities regarding custom election codes, and I've had the good fortune and host with Lara virtual teas with elders. We've had elders come together in their home, in their own bubble during the pandemic, have a lunch together, and then they put one iPad in the room and they share it amongst 3 or 4. And we've linked 3 or 4 homes this way. And we had up to 17 elders over a lunch hour reviewing community membership codes, for example, on one particular occasion. And so there's a perfect blend, as Justin alluded to, of traditional methods of gathering, which is to come together in person in someone's home, have a meal, have tea, and yet we've managed to take it technologically, link those homes together, so now they're all having tea together. And at the same time, they're able to partake in and share their views, historical knowledge of membership rules and codes and ethics to amongst themselves. They can have a general conversation. Now, there's a little bit of learning to do, a little bit of practice, but it's been very successful in several of the communities we've worked with. And so we think that blending the traditional methods of coming together with some technology will, as Justin alluded to, break some of the isolation down and make coming together just a matter of fact. It's not the way we used to do it, but given what we cannot come together that way right now, this is a great alternative. And as I allude and Justin affirms, going forward, this connectivity to our remote communities across British Columbia and across Canada is really going to be critical, because the voice of the community members can now be more readily heard from their living rooms in the council chambers of their communities. So we think this remote access process is going to be a game changer for our First Peoples.
So moving on from why it's important, we get to what is it? Because this Zoom specifically is a technology that hasn't been around for most of our experience. It's Zoom specifically, the platform we're all using today, is a program that came to popularity just over a year ago with the rise of COVID-19. But that's not to say there aren't a few more hanging around there. There are many, and many even came much earlier. And functionally speaking, they all operate very, very close to each other. It is a video conferencing platform, meaning we can all see each other. It means we can all hear each other, and it means we can all share information. So for the purposes of today, we're going to treat them all almost identically, just as Zoom. But that's not to say we won't reach at some point someone having a question of Skype does this or TeamSpeak does this, and that's totally fine. I've experienced almost every bug there is to experience, I feel like, so we'll get to that as we go throughout the presentation. So the first thing to address is, what do all the buttons do? Because a lot of us aren't familiar with this platform as much as we'd like to be, even me with all my poking around. So the biggest thing to remember is where we're supposed to be looking. And this interface will vary very greatly between phones and tablets and computers. But the main thing is the people speaking and the information they're sharing, which is going to be right in the middle of the presentation. So if you can see our presentation, it's right in the middle. There is also on the right-hand side things like chat and a participants list. That very much helps with creating a good environment for everyone involved. One, in being able to share messages without interrupting those speaking, whether it be a presentation, a community meeting, being able to share longer thoughts without detracting from flow of conversation. As well, that allows things like a raise hand functionality. So instead of interrupting a presenter or a friend speaking, you can simply notify everyone that I have a question, I would like to ask something, please get to me when you have some time. That allows, especially with the delay that comes with internet communication, it allows for a little more leeway in how we communicate. There's also along the bottom a whole bunch of buttons that don't make much sense to most. Participants, chat, share screen, all of those things. And for the most part, they can be generally ignored if you aren't the person hosting something like a presentation or a community meeting. Pressing participants, for instance, brings you up a list of everyone involved, and that's fantastic, but has a limited functionality if it's just yourself and some community members giving feedback, because as a community member, I would not need to see everyone's name. Now, the button on the very far right is actually somewhat important for a participant in that it allows you to raise a hand or give a little virtual wave without turning on your camera. And that's useful for very, very simple communication, saying I am here and I am present, I am listening, or I have a question, again, without interrupting flow of conversation. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see things like mute or turn off your camera. Those are important controls because, as everyone here is very politely doing, we have everyone muted. And we appreciate that because it means that everyone here can participate equally in listening to what we have to share. In addition, it allows us to speak without worrying about a dog barking in the background or a kid having fun with their parents. As much as we all might like to hear those things, it can detract from sometimes serious conversations, sometimes important information.
And one of the other details that comes from that is that often these in this technology, when the microphone gets activated, some of the setup features allow for the camera to switch to that microphone. So if we're making a presentation, or if you're making a presentation, and one of your audience attendees has their microphone left on, and let's say, for example, their camera's on, then what'll happen is that noise will take our camera off the presentation and move it to the noise or the source of that sound. And so that's disruptive to the flow. So as a host and a presenter, you would ask your guests who are the attendees to politely mute themselves so as to maintain the continuity of the presentation. In some exchanges, which Justin and I just worked on over the weekend, we had an engagement with a sort of a small community committee, as it were, and everyone left their mics open so we could have a free flow of conversation. People raised their hands physically, not virtually, so we could take turns to speak. So we could leave our mics open, people could get quick conversations back and forth, and it kept the dialogue going. Really critical. And of course, the other side of that question with speaking is that if you don't have a microphone close enough to you and you don't speak loud enough, sometimes you'll say your words and then stop talking, and the microphone actually never picks you up. And we've had that difficulty in some boardroom settings. So keeping the mic muted when it's important, so it keeps the focus of the camera on the presentation. And then when you do have a microphone on, make sure you're close to it so it can activate and hear you properly.
And we'll expand on that a little bit more as we go forward, actually, but that's a good introduction. Expanding on Mark's point slightly, the very top right of both the mute and turn off video buttons, there's a little arrow. And this setting is found in every software. It allows you to change which microphone you're currently using, be that one connected to your computer or an external one, as we are using here today. That allows you to alter some of the settings you have for both video and audio, and we'll walk through why that's important later, but it's important for you to know where those things are and having the right one selected. Up in the top left, there is something called turn on or off original audio, depending on if it is on or off. That allows you to hear someone more clearly through a presentation, though that is usually only available when using external microphones such as these. You also have the recording notification. That can be important depending on what the use case is, though especially in First Nations communities, there is a lot of trust placed in leadership, and with that trust comes the responsibility for transparency. So things like community meetings or things that should be shared with community, recording them and placing them on, say, a nation's website or on a Facebook post allows you to really say to everyone, even if you couldn't make it, please watch this and then share your comments with us once you've seen what we discussed on the day or that date. So moving on from what all the fancy buttons do, we're going to go to what are all of the settings that might sound a little scary, and they certainly can. So within any program, there are general settings, audio-video settings, moderation settings, functionality settings, and profile settings. I'm going to give a very brief overview of all of them because we could be here all day if I was going to go one by one in each individual option. So general settings cover things like what color the software might be or how it interacts. Does it minimize? What account is it linked to? Those very, very basic things that most software needs access to. And a lot of those settings aren't going to be integral to change on a day-to-day basis. Audio-video settings, however, can be something that you change on a day-to-day basis because, for instance, you can hopefully hear us pretty clearly, but if we suddenly change the microphone to be coming from our laptop's computer, the audio changes drastically. I'm hoping you can hear that.
You can give us a thumbs up if you can hear that.
And it can really change the quality of a presentation because no longer can you hear us right next to you. It becomes a very hollow sounding, echoey, tinny sound that isn't pleasant for anyone to listen to. But switching back to something a little more professional, you get the ability to interact with us more clearly. So moving on from audio and or much different sound. Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Hey, Paul.
Moving on from that, and we will go into why that matters and how you can make your own presentations a little bit better later. But going on to the video side of that, that can also be incredibly important because even if you have the right camera setup and the right lighting and the right background and the right everything, if you've accidentally selected a camera that's plugged in the other room or a webcam that isn't necessarily very good or the camera built into a laptop, for instance, that can ruin the presentation. Additionally, there are options that usually don't make sense. For instance, I told Mark about this not too long ago. There's an option within Zoom, if you go into the video settings, it's called HD, or sometimes Enable HD, depending on your platform. It enables HD in the way that it enables a fisheye lens. It doesn't actually make the current picture you see here with me and Mark in it a higher definition. It just exposes more of the room around us. So it's a little deceptive, and playing around with those settings outside of being inside a presentation or a meeting can make those things go much, much smoother, because you won't be surprised when all of a sudden my picture doesn't look as it should, or I don't sound as I should. Guaranteeing those things ahead of time makes everyone much happier.
So the suggestion here is, of course, is with Zoom, one of the advantages is you can set up your own meeting and do all your tests on your own. You don't have to engage too many other people. Obviously, having some friend on the other line to help feedback some of your test results will be important. But it's really important to, as Justin says, come to before your presentation, check all your settings, make sure that the camera you got selected is the one you want in your room. Because in this particular room, I think we have 4 cameras that are in this room right now. One is plugged into the machine, but the laptop has its own. We have another laptop on the next desk, and we have another remote camera behind it. So there's lots of cameras potentially to be wired in, either digitally or hardwired. So very important detail that way. But that being said, the audio settings, really cool that you could see and probably hear the differences. We're going to go into more detail of how that happens, and Justin's going to explain a little bit about these fancy glowing microphones in front of us.
Before we get to that, I just want to finish off with moderation functionality and profile. So moderation settings are changing how a meeting works. For instance, are participants able to unmute themselves? Very important for something like community feedback or a committee meeting. There's also things such as enabling someone to have co-hosting permissions, allowing people to share their screen, allowing people to send messages in chat, all of which have their ups and downsides. There's the sharing of opinion, which is fantastic. There's the ability for participation, which is amazing. However, those things come into play when suddenly there is someone within chat or within let's say within the meeting, and they have forgotten to mute themselves as they walked away and gone to do dishes or gone to go to the washroom, and their cat is running all over their keyboard, as sometimes will happen. That's when it's important for moderation to properly be set up, so that someone, aside from the presenter, who might be occupied with the presentation, can go through and mute that person. And that's important for a whole host of reasons, but that covers also the ability for people to moderate the chat as it comes through in a variety of programs. OBS is one that comes to mind. And being able to keep a safe environment for everyone where all those involved feel like they can be heard and appreciated.
And moderation is important in a sort of a real person context. We're asking the guests who are participating in the conference on Zoom to honor each other's and respect each other's time and place, make point of working through, now like a regular meeting, a direct conversation through the chair, the person who is hosting the conversation. And in a public meeting, as we've been hosting quite a bit, as opposed to committee meetings, which everyone is equal, in a hosted community setting, you want the conversation going through to the moderator who has the control to manage the flow of the conversation so that it keeps it positive. It can be possible without the right kind of parameters that these kind of meetings and side chats can get into some poor ethical areas. And so we really want to encourage that doesn't happen by letting one know that the host can turn off the mics, can suspend chat if necessary, and people are expected to behave in a proper fashion and be polite, give way to the host as the host of the meeting, and allow for fulsome answers to each and every inquiry, and with little or no interruptions. So really important to have those sort of rules up front to moderate the program going forward.
Yeah, and just as Mark said, that crosses over into a lot of our common sense for in-person communication and feedback. You wouldn't, for instance, allow someone to get up at the front of the room and start yelling whatever they pleased. That's generally unacceptable behavior in any social situation. And the gap in understanding comes from inexperience with this platform. People think that I can unmute myself and say whatever I please at any time, when in fact there is a social obligation to be kind to those around you. Going down the list a little bit, we go into functionality settings, which covers quite a bit, to be frank, but that's everything from green screen backgrounds to screen share or a second camera, things that might be good as feature sets but might not be present in every single software you're going to use. Those you should be more familiar with if you plan on using them. It's very, very, very recommended to poke around in all these things. Go into the recording, go into the green screen, go into the whatever it is settings, and play with it, because who knows how well you're going to know it day of. Next, we get into profile settings, especially with Zoom. That's actually something that's worthy of note. Zoom inherently has a 1 hour, I believe, limitation on meetings without a paid account. So we have seen nations accidentally not know this and cut their community meetings short by without that proper knowledge. So having that set up ahead of time is very important. But in addition, you can only host one meeting at a time. And with community engagement and feedback being very important, that means that nations or organizations often have several accounts so that multiple meetings can be held, maybe an internal staff meeting at the same time that a community engagement is happening. There also falls security in there, so making sure passwords are adequately complicated and sometimes ludicrous by their nature, but that's okay. We also want to make sure that those things are kept secure, because with that profile having insecure access, you rely on the morality of those who do have the password to represent the government or organization. So, going back to what we said a little bit earlier, why good sound and good video is important. Aside from the obvious of it looks nice and it sounds nice, there is a pretty objective benefit to, say, good camera and good lighting. You can, for instance, see Mark and I. That's because we have several lights set up throughout our little studio here. But if we had had a window behind us, the light would bleed through and make us very dark, similar to the halo effect in a lot of paintings and photography.
And I guess you look at the example we have on the screen, and this is unfortunately what we see a lot of as we move around doing the work we do. And there's no offense to anybody, as long as their audio is good, having a poor back visibility for this particular person as a participant is not an issue. But if this person was actually a host of a presentation, and you're given some responsibilities for them to host a meeting of a committee or a small community session, and they were to be the host, choosing to sit themselves in front of a window without properly drawing the blinds, it takes away the impact they're having of being able to see their face. So Justin's point is valid. Mind the background. Make sure you have a higher contrast so you can be seen, because you're making a presentation. Of course, if you're a member or participant in an event and it's not really key or critical that your presentation be that significant, that's fine. But be aware that this is a challenge for the camera.
So going down the list of points, Mark nailed it right on the head with lights. It's important to remember that cameras operate the same way that eyes do. They absorb light. So especially with most of us working from home in an environment that is not set up like a studio, most of us don't have light set up right beside a computer monitor or a laptop. So what I've seen most frequently done is just get a bedside lamp or a desk lamp and set it up right beside your computer. The more light that bounces off of your face into a camera, the better. Without adequate lighting, you see grainy, and that's when the footage looks blurry and low frame rate, so when it's hard to catch up, and hard to discern detail. That's when you have too little light. Having no bright lights behind you, Mark covered perfectly. A static background is usually a good idea, because as much fun as, and I'm hoping you'll be able to see our camera here, as much as the fun tropical background is, it can be distracting. And especially in a serious environment, that's not what you want to engage in. It's much preferable to have, in this case, we have a green screen, though static and clean, undistracting backgrounds. A plain white wall is perfect. but avoiding things like a cluttered, messy room or an office that maybe hasn't seen as much organization as it should. Kids' toys are a very frequent one. Good neutral backgrounds cover things like bookcases or things on the wall, pictures, diplomas, those kinds of things. Not that they'll be able to read them, but they are a neutral background that won't distract from a presenter and what they're trying to convey. Because even without in-person communication, Zoom's allows for a lot of body language. It allows you to tell whether I'm fuming mad or kindly expressing a sentiment. So those kinds of things can be important. Also covered there is audio, which is hard to present in a PowerPoint presentation, but you've seen you've heard the demonstration we gave before of echoey, tinny sound versus something nicer from an external audio source. So the reason this is very important and the reason it can sometimes be less thought of is everyone thinks of what they look like and how they present, because we're all used to an in-person format where a person's voice is all they need to be heard. However, with the rise of video communication software and video conferencing software, we see a change in the way people need to think about these things. For instance, audio quality is a very, very big one. But in addition to that, where that is coming from is going to be a very, very big difference. Me coming to you now has an audio quality that is obviously very different from the laptop speakers. And I won't go into the technology of how that works because it's not very important and it's also very boring. But suffice to say, the smaller and lower quality a receptacle for noise can be, the less nice it is to listen to. So USB microphones can be purchased on Amazon or from Best Buy or a whole host of different companies, but you don't need something incredibly fancy to sound nice. We'll cover that in a little bit. Being close to an audio source is also incredibly important because as I talk to you here, you can hopefully hear me quite clearly. But as I slowly roll my chair back, I become almost completely inaudible, if at all. So being able to hear me is very important. And as much as I love body movement and gesturing and making it seem as lively as possible, I have to keep a muscle memory of where the microphone is. Otherwise, I'll start gesturing wildly over here and you won't be able to hear me as clearly. No background noise is very important because just like the background from before, that can be distracting. And especially with the limitations of technology, it can even make you completely inaudible, meaning that if I had Mark talking at the same time,
that would not be good.
Right, our voices would overlap, and you would probably hear neither of us as an end result. So making sure that everyone in your household knows you're on a Zoom call, closing the door, finding an isolated room, all those things can greatly increase. Having a stable internet connection is very, very large. A wired connection is usually recommended because a wired connection, remember those blue Ethernet cables before Wi-Fi? Having those creates a limitation in what can fail because Wi-Fi is very convenient. I love it, but it's not always reliable. In addition, it allows for faster speeds, meaning that you will be able to see and hear those within your participants and the presenters more clearly because you will have, in the same way you stream Netflix or YouTube, there's a higher video quality available. It's the exact same with Zoom. You are streaming multiple video sources at once. Better connection helps with that. A final point that is worth touching on is the difference between video and audio. The presentation we're giving to you today is gladly something you're participating in, but the information being shared is something that is very, very possible if I, for instance, do this. If I turn off the video, you can still understand what I'm sharing. That presentation does deteriorate slightly, but it can continue. Let's say your webcam fails and breaks completely midway through a presentation. That's not the end of the world. However, if your microphone, whether it be external or in a laptop or something, fails, that means no one can hear you. Not many people know sign language enough to understand it. I certainly wouldn't know how to present in sign language, so that limits a lot of what can be done. So having, for instance, a backup on hand, or having something that's maybe of lesser quality but still passable, is always recommended, because radio is a great demonstration of that. Telephones. We did not learn the Star Trek video conferencing thing for years after that came out, but we had radio for decades before it. So very important to remember.
Another part about the stable internet connection, we know that and for some of our clients that we work with, being remote, as a lot of the communities are, internet quality is not the best. In fact, it's a bit of embarrassment. And as one of our national goals is to make sure we have broadband internet access to every community in the country, so that they can maintain this connectivity. And just to Justin's point about stable internet connections, if you are on the verge of a dial-up connection, which some of the communities I've been working with recently have been struggling with, what we found that if in a Zoom conversation, if we're asking someone who's in a remote location to speak to a matter or share something specific, and if they have an unstable connection where the sound is going in and out for them and their voice is fading from us, by them turning off their video feed, the camera to their location, as Justin alluded to, the audio portion, the microphone portion, is what's going to carry your meeting. So if everyone can talk, not everyone can be seen, you can still have your meeting, just like a telephone. And in fact, one of the things that we are doing now as we do send out messages or invitations to Zoom events is, especially for those in remote places, is we send along the telephone number to phone in on as well. So that if you don't have that stable internet connection that you deserve, if you can get to a landline, you can actually make a phone call as well and join the Zoom conference. It pops up on the screen, your name can be placed there, there's no picture in place, but you're in the program and you can hear what's going on. And it's critical for, as we had on the weekend, we had some elders dialing in who didn't have a laptop in their home, but they had a phone and they could participate in this conversation. And that was really powerful for the community to have their voices heard that morning. So stable internet connection, know it, strive for a good one. But I think there's the upside of what Justin's alluding to here in this presentation at this point is the microphone, your sound, your voice is what's going to carry a meeting. And so doing your part to ensure that your voice can be heard when you're making a presentation is critical. Investments in microphones don't have to be large, but they should be considered, and getting them as a quality, as a close to you to speak to is the best. And when you're sharing microphones, having a second one to pass around is not unheard of, so that people can then be better heard as well. Really makes the meeting work. People are, as I said earlier, if you're too far from the microphone, by the time you start talking and you stop talking, sometimes the microphone can actually hear only the beginning and the end of it. And then me at the other end of the line on the Zoom conference, I only heard one word out of 5. So it's really critical about the microphone being close, being good quality, and remote separate USB microphones we found are leading the way right now.
So that actually gets into the next point I'd like to make here, which is based around what equipment is worth considering. So we'll cover the left-hand column, what Mark was speaking to, microphones. A USB separate microphone can be purchased for as little as $10 off Amazon, and that will get the job done. However, something like a microphone we're using here today can cost in the hundreds of dollars. Separate XLR sound mixing proper microphones can cost in the thousands of dollars if you really want to go to the very top end. So it's hard to discern what's worth obtaining. The simple answer is whatever you're comfortable with. So long as your nation or you as a presenter are able to comfortably function within the budget you've set, then fantastic. And it is a part of a 3-step system, so microphone, camera, and lighting. But with microphone specifically, it is probably the most important part because, as Mark just said, and we've said several times, the voice of a presenter or of a participant is what's going to carry a meeting, not how pretty we look in makeup, though I did spend a lot of time on that.
Me too. I worked out really hard this morning.
So there's also the question of setup and complication because, for instance, a USB microphone can be very straightforward. It's a cable. It plugs into a laptop or a desktop computer, be that a Mac or a PC, and it usually just functions right out of the box. Pretty straightforward, even if the use might be a little inintuitive sometimes or unintuitive. So there is a little bit of setup. I would very, very heavily recommend reading ahead, watching video guides or reviews,
Zoom does
reading
help.
articles, figuring these things out ahead of time, because the last thing you want to do is invest in equipment only to find that it doesn't work for you. Next up, we have camera, and that can actually be fairly important, not because a lower quality camera is worse, but because the camera might not even match that well. Something I alluded to earlier is some webcams have a very hard fisheye, meaning that instead of a flat plain image, as you can see with us, it has a fisheye lens, and most webcams do, in fact, meaning you see a very warped, stretched out image along the sides, which is generally not good for a presentation. It may be fantastic for in-person communication, where you're trying to capture everyone in a room, and it'd be that a boardroom, a community hall, whatever it is. So it has its uses, but you want to make sure you're adapting your setup for you rather than what is an industry standard. Because again, Googling what is the best camera will only get you results that show, well, this is my $100,000 setup, and here's how you can do it too, which is generally out of the realm of most people's accessibility, especially a nation who values transparency and funding so highly. Next up, we get to lighting. Something that's very subjective and not easy to do wrong. Simply make sure you're lit well enough to see. And that can come in the form of a ring light, which is what you see up at the top there, powered sometimes by USB. For most instances, that will work perfectly. In our case here, we have the option that you see at the bottom, which is an LED panel, which is what allows us to light an entire room and a green screen behind us without suffering from proximity, though that's a very specific use case.
And right now, as Justin said, we've got the little square panel LED box in this room right now, but I personally have that little round ring light you see at the top right there clipped to the side of my personal laptop and desktop system, so that if I need to be in a Zoom call with a client or for some of the other board work that I do, I can clip it on the side of my screen, angle it in such a way as to light me appropriately, and I can then continue on in a meeting no matter what the day or time is, so I can keep myself well lit in a conversation. And as I've taken Justin's advice, and I take this particular microphone that I have right now and I plug it into my own personal desktop and have my meeting using that, because I've found that having this accessibility to the sound and having the microphone, this quality, ensures that those who are going to be listening to what I have to say, if I'm reporting on something, they get to hear everything I'm saying. And we really can't emphasize enough how important the audio setup is in delivering your message, either as a presenter or as a participant. So these are some of the examples that were real life examples we can share.
Also, also keeping in mind that having the light source ahead of you is very important. For instance, most rooms come equipped with an overhead light of some kind, whether that be a ceiling fan or an LED panel in a office. That typically tends to be unflattering, let's say, because as a upward-facing light, it casts shadows downwards, meaning from the nose, from the eyebrows, from the hairline, from the chin. All those shadows that can look unflattering come to light. For instance, think of the lighting difference between looking at yourself in the mirror in a kitchen and the mirror in the bathroom, where the lights in the bathroom are faced more towards you. It's more flattering. And that's what you're trying to imitate in a presentation, is lights going forward rather than down. Going back to the whole window thing, also behind you is a bad one. So moving on a little bit, we'll get into questions of, oh, I saw this on Amazon or I saw this on Best Buy. Those we can get to a little bit later, but suffice to say, so long as you read thoroughly and diligently, someone else will have bought this for a very similar purpose, and they've probably shared that experience in a Google or an Amazon review or a blog post or a YouTube video. So keep in mind there's always an answer somewhere.
Bit of homework can help.
Yeah, even if it's harder to find. So read ahead. Next, we get into the actual practice of using this software and engaging in some of the practices that can be better to keep in mind. So creating a meeting. So meetings must be created ahead of time. That's very important. It avoids, just as was done today in this presentation, The link was shared ahead of time with everyone who wanted to participate. Now you tell me about lighting. Thank you, Paul. I know it's not something we usually think about. It can be. We'll get into that a little bit
Thanks, Paul.
later again, actually. Thank you. But preparing these meetings ahead of time ensures that everyone who wants to participate can. Sending those meeting links maybe more than once so that they don't get lost in an email chain. People have a chance to add them to calendars and events, those kinds of things. Very, very, very helpful. Prepare meetings to align with desired outcomes. If you'd like to actually
Sure.
go through this.
And meeting preparation online is not a lot different than meeting preparation in person. It's about planning, be prepared. Any skilled presenter has their notes, has their flow, and looks to find ways to move whatever it is that they're presenting to the public or to the participants in a way that's most effective. So one of the formats is discussed is open discussion. Now in a Zoom conference, as we talked about earlier, you can make these decisions ahead of time. We're all going to agree that we'll make a presentation. The speaker will speak for 7 or 8 minutes, to which I will ask that all of you mute your microphones so that there's no interruption to my presentation. After my presentation, we'll open the floor to questions and answers. If everyone's okay, we can open all of our mics up, but we also have to remember we can only talk one at a time. So it's a little bit about being a good host and about making sure we understand some of the rules, because you're going to have participants, as I said. We've had tea with the elders, and they're not sufficiently practiced in some ways. Mind you, I've got a few elders on my list that are quite good at their phone use, but Zoom is new for everyone, so mute is best. And then asking people to join you in, and then but also having that discussion with your participants about the time it takes to hold a conversation. One of the things that we do as professional ed presenters is make room for questions and opportunity for people to comprehend the presentation by making space for air to sit. It's a difficult situation when you're doing it live audio presentations for you to stop talking. But by doing that change of pace, that presentation style allows for thoughts and questions. So when I ask you to, in a few minutes, to unmute yourselves and turn your cameras back on, I won't have an expectation you'll be jumping to it as soon as I ask. It'll take a moment. So I will then ask for your participation, and then I will stop talking. Now let that sound sit so you know, because there's also a lag time in the system. What I see is a 2-minute delay, a 2-second delay here, comes up as 1 second for you. It's a little unbearable for me, the presenter, because it seems like a long time, but you as a viewer are only getting half the lag time. So by letting that moment sit, your presentation has more of a natural style. Don't feel you need to pump in the void, all kinds of chatter, just to make sure you're always being heard. Because it's important in our comprehensive skills as humans, we need that time. We need that time for the presenter to pause, be expressive, and then when there's a moment in your presentation to hold, feel comfortable, you can. And what it does, it allows for those who have thoughts or questions to begin to formulate them without having to then lose track of your next part of your presentation. So that's an important part of the style you do. So in a Zoom conference, do your best to not feel pressured to talk all the time. Hold it down. That's the presentation. The education department, you want people to move from a place of not knowing something to having known something. So you've got to make sure you style your presentation and your Zoom conversation in such a way as that people can learn a thing as you want them to do. And that will take a little time, which means you'll have to take the time to do it. Feedback's important, and this is really critical for us as always. So what we do in a way of our work generally is we'll open up a meeting with a round circle introduction. And so we'll get everyone to present who they are, what their expectations are for this meeting, have a bit of a conversation about what the agenda is of course, going forward. And then as we finish our meeting and we've achieved our educational outputs from the presenter's point of view, we would then ask and clarify with the audience to get their feedback. So as our rule goes for us, we'll then wrap a meeting up with a round circle check-in to close. That's important. Now, you have to plan for that. You've got 12 participants, three minutes per person. Let's say it's even 2 minutes per person. That's 24 minutes to get through a round of introductions and closings. You've got to style your presentation to allow for that. So if you've got a 1 hour and a half presentation time and you've got a 1 hour, 45-minute presentation, you're only leaving 35 to 40 minutes to do your introductions. The size of your crowd, your group will maybe limit that. But that's a way for people to believe that they're actually part of something by able to be introduce themselves, know who the participants are. Because I know Sean and Morning Bull have met before. Norma Wolfchild, I think we've met before. But as we do this presentation and we do this check-in, I would get to know who you are and then know a little bit about you. So if I had questions or something to answer from, I know who to talk to about those things. So that's an important piece of letting people know who else is in the meeting. And don't always assume everyone knows exactly who you are and all your details that you want to be shared. Do your best to be open about who you are and what you got to share. We talked a little bit about the co-hosting facility. The advantage of that is, and Justin and I have talked about this, and I've had other Zoom conferences before, where the presenter has a third party away from their presentation administering the function of letting the guests in, monitoring the chat, and supporting any of the open microphones that pop up. Because as we know, people turn the microphone off, make their presentation comment, then they sit back down, and they may forget. So it's helpful to have that ability as a co-host. Controlling who's an open and private attendees, really critical for that third person, especially in a hosted community meeting, to make sure that the participants are members of the community. We know that in some communities they only allow members to attend, and so we always ask that a member of the community be that gatekeeper to allow people into a meeting. So that's whether it's open or private. And if it's a private community meeting, it's up to the community to work with the host to ensure that those who are in attendance are supposed to be there. And so we use that through the authentication process in the waiting room. So you get your guests to stay there, you discuss whether they're eligible to be there, and then you admit them accordingly. And as we've found with our company, a Cardin account, and if we happen to be hosting meetings in the same day, we'll often get some of our 1 o'clock guests booking into a 3 o'clock appointment, knowing it's the same invitation, but I recognize that they've missed the first meeting, and this is not one they're invited to. So often in the last few weeks, actually seen guests who are either from the previous meeting or for the next meeting trying to get into the current meeting. So it's really important to use that waiting room feature to make sure you're letting in the people who are supposed to be in your meeting. I mean, I can only imagine how embarrassing it would be to invite somebody into a meeting who have nothing to do with your community or your meeting, and they show up in the meeting, they'll not know what they're doing or where they are. So really be mindful of that.
And that also covers a lot of the things that can come from distractions. So in a presentation setting, making sure that, one, your material matches that. So whether it's a PowerPoint presentation, a video, pictures, slides, a script, whatever it happens to be, matches the flow of expected conversation and is more catered and tailored towards the expected audience. Now, especially with the waiting room feature, and most of the facilitation that goes along with moderating and co-hosting and all those things that we just discussed, ideally it's not the presenter. So in this case, Mark and I are both here, and while I'm talking, he's reading the chat, he's looking at other people's cameras, and vice versa, to ensure that things are going smoothly, nothing needs to be addressed. But especially if you're a single person giving a presentation, chairing a meeting, whatever it happens to be, you want someone to be able to do that without yourself getting distracted and making everyone else wait while you catch up on 20 chat messages or answer a particular question that someone had. Instead, it's better to have other people help you with the presentation in the exact same way you would in an in-person one.
The beautiful thing about Zoom is that Shauna can have hosting permissions and help us present this presentation from her location in Calgary, and we're doing the presentation from Calgary. So as a team, people can collaborate from one community to the next, or from one location to another to support a presentation. That's a beautiful feature.
And that actually transitions quite well into what we have next, which is what you do with a lot of these settings, because having these meetings set up ahead of time, you need to make sure that all of those are set up right. So when you click schedule a new meeting in Zoom, for instance, this is what you see. That can look darn intimidating for someone who's not familiar with this entire process, the functionality that goes along with it, or maybe an elder who's been asked to take the lead in a particular project. In 30 years, I certainly won't understand any of this or be able to read it. So having different links, so that means creating a different meeting ID is fairly important, setting up security ahead of time, making sure that all participants are allowed to join, or maybe only some, who is allowed to join via what method, for instance, telephone or computer. There's also even more settings in addition to that under advanced options. And those are important to monitor, especially in a professional environment, though every individual software will have a different screen than either of those, but they don't vary hugely in how you set them up. It's, again, going through the general settings, the moderation, and making sure that the environment is friendly for everyone. As of our next point entirely, we get into meeting invitations and how they're spread, so how news about these things goes out. So especially for a community meeting with nations, a huge majority use a platform like Facebook. Not to say that it'll be around forever, but for right now, it's a very big way that communities engage, especially with members living off reserve. So Facebook or Twitter or a website, a video hosting platform like YouTube, all of these things can serve as great ways to notify membership or participants of an upcoming meeting or engagement. Making sure that those things are done ahead of time is incredibly important. Also, group emails fall under that list as well. That's more specific to membership being contacted or a pre-existing list of authenticated people. Also, preparing the invitations ahead of time, meaning writing that email or preparing that Facebook post, not just writing whatever comes to your head and copy-pasting the link, because you want it to be easy to understand. The link should be very easy to see. There should be very little excessive detail. You want it to be as easy to consume as possible because, quite frankly, people get bored by 10 paragraphs of writing, especially in things like Facebook or articles on a website, so short and to the point.
And one of the things I'm learning that's critical is the medium to which people are receiving this information will limit their capacity to be able to see as much as you would like. So by, as Justin said earlier, putting too much into the invitation, like attaching other written materials, agendas, and those sort of things to the invitation, if you're viewing this on a phone, can limit what you can see and how effective it is. What you really, as Justin alluded to, is you want to know the time, the date, and the start, when it's going to start of the day, what some of the agenda items are on it, but in medium bullet form, any links. And so really critical to make the invitation concise, to the point, and not too many distracting details. Because you have to imagine if someone's reading on a Facebook post on a phone, they're only going to see 4 or 5 lines of a material at one shot. And as our lives are busy, and a member is engaging with this on their phone, and if something else comes up in their life, they put the phone down. They've only had that one moment to look at all that information. They know there's a meeting, what and how much time and date. That's all they should be able to know. And if they want more, they can go ahead and put it in the calendar and get prepared. But be short, be concise, and be timely. Important to give people, as Justin said, early notification and then a last minute notification, so as a gentle reminder.
Also, for just general rules of how they should be presented, we put on the right-hand side just some easy things to remember is time, when it's expected to start and end. An end time is equally as important. To respect your participants' time, you don't want to say, it starts at 9 and it goes until we're finished, because you want people to be able to schedule around it and participate for the entirety of a presentation or a meeting or a feedback engagement session. Dates, date if a single event, or multiple dates if it is going to be multiple different engagements or sessions. A summary, usually no longer than a couple sentences. You're not going to present your entire script or presentation there. It's just going to be an overview of a topic. An agenda, making sure that everyone knows what to expect and when. A meeting link, for obvious reasons, and required materials. So if you would have asked people, if it's an education session, for instance, to have read things ahead of time, or if you would ask them to bring their own particular things to present individually, all those things need to be identified because you want your participants to be prepared or your members to be prepared. The very last point on the left-hand side is clarify who will be participating. This avoids a lot of hassle during the actual date and time. So for instance, if it is a private group of membership to the community without outside invitation, that establishes well in advance that you can't invite your 7 friends to come along and join. And that avoids conflict during that time. Saves everyone a whole lot of hassle. Going on a little bit to describe what those agendas are and why they're important is because, especially in First Nations communities, we have some things to keep in mind. So in establishing them, I'm going to read them one for one, and then I'll have Mark maybe expand on them a little bit. Be willing to be flexible. Our Indigenous way of listening respects the time of all speakers more than a Western question and answers 2-minute segment. Be prepared to add time to listen. That covers what Mark said a little bit earlier. Especially with our communities and our nation and our history, elders and community members who suffer from a past in residential schools or intergenerational residential school effects, being constantly pressed to give an answer right now, doesn't inspire confidence in an answer or even sometimes an answer at all. It can raise anxieties and fears and pressures, and that's not a good way to host a meeting. Sensitivity to those things, and especially keeping in mind that people may not be comfortable sharing their opinions right away. You have to give time to breathe, time to listen. Even if it seems like you have something great to say, you may just want to listen to all of their point, all of their answer to a question, all of their question, because a part of feeling respected as a participant is to have felt listened to and felt valued and engaged. And that's sometimes something that we skip over as presenters. Everyone does it from time to time, but it's something to keep in mind for sure. The next point is many communities have members with passionate viewpoints on certain topics. Ensure ample time is available as well as a clear dispute resolution process is introduced. That covers 2 different points. One, that there is going to be sometimes some conflict, especially in community meetings, being such tight-knit membership. We are going to be very much engaged with each other. There's going to be a history between membership and participants, and sometimes it's not always a wholesome friendship. Sometimes you've had a disagreement the night before or going longer than that. And so the dispute resolution process introduced ahead of time, right at the beginning, means establishing, right as you introduce who you are or who the chair of the meeting is, saying, I'm going to ask that everyone throughout the meeting be muted. If you do have something to say, please raise your hand. We'll allow for people to ask questions of the chair of the meeting or of each other. But please be respectful that you can only speak once introduced or once someone has finished talking, and establish that if you do violate the rules of the meeting, actions will have to be taken from a moderation side, whether that being muted or removed, because you want to make sure everyone feels welcome. If there is a very small minority making people feel unwelcome, that's an unhealthy environment, and you don't want to encourage that. Insert breaks throughout at regular intervals. I think our next slide is a break, or maybe the one after that. But making sure that people feel engaged, because even as presenters, us sitting down for 2-3 hours at a time, it can get exhausting. Not from a physical side, but from a mental side. You may start to drag. You may start to hesitate. Your audience may start to walk away. And that's something that happens fairly frequently, especially over digital and virtual engagement, where people don't feel a particular punction about just disconnecting. Because after they've disconnected, you can't call them on their name because they're not there anymore. So you want to make it as accessible as possible. Say, take a 10-minute break. Please, we invite you to go get a coffee, walk around, share what you've learned with a friend, and then come back. Because it's important for all of our health and all of our well-being. Plan time for introductions and conclusions. Oftentimes that can take much longer than you'd imagine. Especially in First Nations communities, we pride our personal history and our personal identity quite a lot, quite rightly so. So if I want to make sure everyone has time for a proper introduction that includes a traditional name and an English name and a nation that you come from and the nation's history and this involvement and why they're here today and why their family is involved, and it's certainly a lot more than the Western style, my name is Justin Chrones, good afternoon. And it can run for quite a lot longer, and especially with conclusions. A lot of people feel the desire to share what they've learned and reiterate a lot of that information, and that's perfectly fine because sometimes they may raise points that you hadn't thought of or reflect and bring ideas that hadn't been considered before. Those are important to hear. And that's why a conclusion is not just something that is right at the end point. It is instead something that should be scheduled for. You should allow ample time for that to play out as you see fit.
We spoke that earlier about the formatting your meeting and making sure that you're doing introductions, which is appropriate, that you account for, as I said, 10 or 12 guests, 1 to 2 minutes per person. You're looking at 15 to 20 minutes to get through a group of people that are the introductions and give them the time that they need and overcome some of the technical challenges of pressing the buttons and unpressing the buttons, that sort of stuff. So patience and planning, that's all we can suggest.
And that also gets into a little bit of presentation material. So discussed earlier, as we're using right here, a PowerPoint is a great example. Just before we started, Mark caught a little bit of a typo that was in there, so we fixed that. But having someone review ahead of time any presentation materials, aside from the person creating them, one, because you get invested in what you're writing and it may not reflect as easily to an immediate review. Same way when you're cooking something, it doesn't smell as delicious when you put it on the plate. You have to allow time either away from the material to reread it or invite a friend or a coworker to review it with you. That's inclusive of videos, pictures, any presentation. A script is quite common as well, prepared and ahead of time. Being very familiar with the material allows you to focus on your speaking movements and feedback instead of constantly reading and watching your own material. That's huge because if we're going through this presentation, neither of us created it, we certainly need to read it ahead of time. Otherwise, we would have no idea. I wouldn't be able to say, well, Mark, I think you should cover this part. Justin, maybe I should cover this segment here because I'm more experienced in that topic and Mark's more experienced in that one. And the third point in there, I'm going to read word for word, keeping in mind the irony of that. Reading a PowerPoint is not a presentation. Expand on your ideas and engage your audience. It can sometimes be viewed as adequate to just read your presentation like a script. Frankly, most of us can read. And for those of us that can't, blandly reading a script word for word in a monotone is not interesting. Expanding on the ideas and introducing new topics as you go is what makes it a presentation rather than just a document that they could read on their own time.
And of course, it says, engage with your audience, which means you stop and do an engagement piece such as, and on that point, does anyone have any examples in their community? And then I would ask Danielle if she had any examples that she could share with us, and then I would give Danielle enough time to turn on her camera and wave at us that she's available to talk to. So those are important details that you not just have the presentation come from yourself, but if you've got a material or subject that your your audience, your participants are passionate in, having them speak their truths and their realities on certain subjects can be very empowering for those who are in the audience as well. So that's where you would get the engagement of your participants in that role there. And then the last one, which is really important, keep the text large, keep it simple and easy to understand. So comprehension is important because we have to work on the premise that not all of we have a very varied audience. Everyone has different capacities and abilities to comprehend the written word. And let's just put it bluntly, this is a written word on a format which is not comfortable or natural. And unless you've been spending the last 15 or 20 years in this format, you will have some hesitation. My 84-year-old father can barely take the moment long enough to read stuff on this page. However, he has a bit of a reading disadvantage as well. So he wouldn't be able to pick out some of the larger words on this presentation. and it would be very difficult for him to follow along. So if we keep things very straightforward, know our audience, what they're capable of, and be mindful that not everyone will be at the same level of comprehension and the ability to actually see what's on the screen. We're making a lot of assumptions, which we shouldn't. So that's where we go back to, once more, the audio portion, how you sound, what you present is going to carry your presentation long further than your written presentation or what's on the screen. And we'll move to our next slide, which is probably going to be time for a break. We're about 8 minutes behind schedule, so we're doing fine. We're pleased with our timing. We're going to take a 5-minute break.
Yeah,
Okay,
let's take
We
a
says 10.
5-minute break or 10. We'll resume as soon as everyone feels comfortable. We'll check in. But go grab something, enjoy a walk around specifically, because if you just sit down, you're going to end up falling asleep. I can promise you. I've done it a few times. And make sure you come back feeling engaged and interested. So we'll see you soon.
We'll come back at 20 minutes after the hour, which is 8 minutes from now. All right? Talk soon.
Hi. So we'll grab a quick break and then we'll resume back and see you in a few.
Hello again. I'm just wanting to check in with Shauna or Danielle. I do understand that the session today was scheduled until 12 our time, 1 your time. Is that correct?
2 hours.
Was it a 2 hour? Was it a 2 hour session?
That was our understanding, yes.
Was my Zoom invite?
Available to confirm that what she's hearing is good, and we'll let Norma know how much more time we'll take of her this morning. So we'll just wait a minute for Norma to unmute herself and turn her camera on. Alrighty. So Norma seems to be away from her camera right now, and we've had requests from Danielle and Shauna that we've perhaps maybe overbooked the morning, and our 2 hour presentation's been asked to be reduced now. We've done our first hour. We've covered a larger part of the presentation. I want to get into some of the more granular details now. Justin has agreed to do a quick summary of the balance of the presentation and move us out of here in the next 20 minutes. So I know we're speaking to Danielle and Shauna directly, so you'll benefit from this brief summary, and we'll move on. Okay.
So one of the first points to cover as we get back is what to do within a presentation. And it comes down to a difference in habits between presentations in person and presentations virtually. Speaking clearly and loudly is a very common one people forget because with people being not in the room, you think you can talk quietly, kind of like this, and it comes through the same, when in fact it does not. You have to speak clearly, loudly, with enough enunciation that even those listening to you out of an iPhone speaker that's underwater could probably understand what's going on. Making sure you're making more or less eye contact in the same general direction, because with a lot of laptop webcams specifically, your presentation is going to be much lower than the view of the webcam. So if I'm speaking down here, you're just getting a top-down shot of my head, which is not great to look at, frankly, and will get worse as I get older. So something a lot of people forget is to be engaged with your audience, not your presentation. Moving forward from that is also making sure your audio, your video, your moderation, everything we've talked about up until now is set up ahead of time. Don't do that in the middle of the presentation. Welcome everyone in. Ensure that everyone feels welcome and appreciated to be there if that's possible. If you're hosting a presentation with many people, welcome as many as you can. Be friendly. Chat before the scheduled time of actual start. Connect well in advance of that. Introducing yourself with humility and respect. That's very important because especially as I'm Haida myself, but I certainly don't have the coloration to look at. So introducing yourself with humility and respect from my point of view is going to be important to make sure that people understand I'm not here to dictate how things need to be done. I'm here to make recommendations based on my experience, my education, and my qualifications. Establish rules for the meeting. We've covered a lot of that with moderation, making sure everyone is respectful of each other and their time. Moving on slightly, not from our background, but rather from the presentation, we have facilitation tips with video. So a lot of what we've just covered, which is speaking to the camera, keeping the lighting centered and ahead of you, making sure that there aren't crazy shadows or lights coming in from windows is a good one. Commit to memory, where you can move on and off camera. So for instance, we are in frame, as is a commonly used term. If I were to continue the presentation while slowly leaning over here, suddenly half my face is cut off. That is a less professional environment to be doing it from. So making sure you and possibly a co-host have adequate room to move around and knowing where you can and cannot be. And be aware of your background, making sure it's not a messy bed or a child's crib. It doesn't necessarily have to be a green screen as we have here today, though that does have its advantages. Just be conscious of what other people are going to see. We also have audio, which is frankly more important for the message being demonstrated. Stay close to the microphone and speak towards it. A very common thing is, well, I have a microphone in front of me. I can speak over here for the entire presentation. And obviously you'll be able to hear that that is not the same thing. Microphones pick up information the same way a human ear does. If someone speaks away from you, they're harder to hear than when they speak directly to you. Avoid and monitor your background noise. Very important for reasons we've covered up until now, but just a brief recap, making sure there aren't screaming children, as fun as
Dogs.
that can be. Dogs are a very common one.
Lawnmowers, chainsaws.
Yeah, leaving yourself unmuted and walking away is a very common one because we all tend to participate in these while doing other things, but making sure you're muted is common courtesy. Be gentle with your microphone, and I want to avoid doing this as much as I can, but tapping the microphone can give some very, very unpleasant experience to your participants. So whatever it's connected to, be that a laptop, if it's just a built-in speaker, meaning typing on the laptop while you're presenting,
Can be heard.
it's one of the worst things to listen to. It's the equivalent of someone tapping on your head as they're talking to you, which is ridiculous. So you wouldn't do that to people in person. Be kind and courteous to those that you're speaking to over these platforms. Speak clearly and loudly. We've covered that. Try and do that as much as possible, both in and out of person, because that makes for a better presentation. And mute when not speaking. That's a part of even presentation, education, facilitating community meetings. You have to be just as respectful as you would expect your participants to be. Now, one point we'd like to cover is how you engage with an audience or participants or membership, making sure that everyone who arrives feels appreciated, engaging them for questions, asking, well, Danielle, what do you think about that topic? Do you have anything to share, Shauna? What's your experience like, Norma? Being able to engage your audience as much as possible when appropriate and as they feel comfortable, making sure that you're aware of how they feel.
And using that format, we've made presentations to almost 75 participants, opening the floor up and getting engagement and feedback along the way. And what we've learned from that 6-session engagement series is that the participants overwhelmingly appreciated the opportunity to be engaged in the presentation. They weren't spoken to, they were part of and somewhat in some way collaborated with the presentation. So that can make it very impactful difference to the way your ongoing series of presentations works on a particular subject. So membership or audience engagement, participation, critical. Plan for and make room in your presentation to do that.
Yeah. And be grateful for those people for participating. It is a good presentation when people have questions to ask. So having specific things that you'd like to say, thank you for sharing. Good question. That's a good way of looking at this. I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you for having the bravery to step up and share your piece. All of those are great ways to make people feel engaged and welcomed and valued is a big one. Be polite and be the bigger person. Especially in community engagement and membership feedback, you will get people who feel wronged or just want to argue. Those people are going to be in every group, not just digitally online. And you need to know when to quit. That's something I actually have quite a problem with sometimes, is knowing when to just say, thank you for sharing, let's move on. Our next piece is go with the flow. Very simply put, that means don't worry about it. Sometimes cameras fail, microphones fail. Sometimes your presentation isn't ready to go. Sometimes a Zoom screen share won't work. Sometimes not enough people show up. Sometimes too many people show up. You have to continue regardless. That's a part of good presentation, is knowing that even if our camera failed right now, I would say, well, I'm sorry our camera failed, but you can listen to us and hear our dulcet tones as we continue throughout the rest of our presentation. It's being able to just say, it happens. And knowing that the people who are engaged with you have had these problems as well. They're going to be understanding so long as you keep it engaging and relevant to what's going on. The longer you use these tools, the more experience you'll have and the easier it'll get. The more experience you'll know that, oh, the webcam failed randomly. I know how to fix that. I've done that before. The show must go on. After a meeting, making sure that you thank everyone, give adequate time for a closing, give details on upcoming meetings and engagement, including all those things that were in a agenda and meeting invitation from before in our topics covered previously, creating meeting minutes to make sure that people who weren't particularly engaged throughout the whole thing or weren't able to stay through the entire presentation can catch up afterwards, as well as know what to expect for future meetings. Making them immediately, make sure that you aren't going to forget half the things that you discussed and half the engagements you got from your participants. This slide I had a little bit of fun with. I've spent the better part of many years, probably more or less the last decade, fixing people's problems with computers and IT. And with that practice comes the understanding that if you've had a problem, someone has had it before. Even if they may not have shared it in the best way, there is always a solution. Whether it's a solution you are thinking of or is ideal is completely separate. Those 3 links that I've provided there, I don't expect you to copy down character for character, but Zoom support, Harvard service, and I believe that's the University of Florida, probably. But they actually give really good resources on how to fix very common problems. For more specific things, Google is your best friend. Or if, as I find often the case, sometimes people tend to write about issues that are visual or experiential based, so don't translate well to the written word. YouTube videos are often a good way to fix that as well. Someone has had the issue, someone can help you, and relying on people within your community, whether that be youth who typically have more experience with technology, whether that be someone more qualified in an area with computer engineering or an IT department in your organization, all of them are there to help. Make sure you rely on them and thank them for their help. And finally, we come to the very end of the presentation, and we hopefully have covered a lot of the topics that you wanted to hear about. This is normally the period where we would ask people to share any questions they have about previous misunderstandings, or this didn't work for me, what can you recommend? But at this point, I'd like to pass it over to Shauna.
Thank you. I took some notes down as you guys were presenting here, and Norma she wrote in the chat that she was back, so she didn't miss a whole lot of the second part, but she did indicate that she does tune in on the recordings. So if we want to just stop the sharing on the screen, then we can all see each other. There we go. There we go. So Norma, do you have any questions?
No, I just wanted to comment. So I had to, we're working from home like everyone else, but I have really poor lighting because I have this bright light behind me. So what I've done is I have this great big selfie light that I usually put in front of my laptop and I plug it in. So whenever I'm doing our workshops, whatever, that's what I use because, I feel that, like you said, blurred, it doesn't have a quite impact. So this helps me. I didn't use it today. I wasn't expected to.
May I make an observation about your background?
Sure.
I really appreciate that you've used the diminishing viewpoint to your best advantage. You've positioned your camera so that your 2 walls meet behind your head, very professionally put together. All I can suggest is you might take a shortcut, find us, I'm assuming that's a fluorescent light in the ceiling?
Yeah.
Yeah. You could try something really quite simple is to put a cloth, staple it to the ceiling boards above you just to diffuse that light out. Just a simple heavy white or even a ivory colored towel or sheet would make a huge difference in that way. And you're right, that big round light you got, the ring light, excellent. But
we actually use those here for our personal meetings. I have one right there that I wish I could grab.
But your diminishing viewpoint, you really nailed it. Well done. And of course, even more so with the design in the hanging on your carpet on the left side of your shoulder, that's also a very nice pattern so as to draw people into and help balance the eye as a room. And one of the things we did learn in our psychology recently with some research about Zoom is that for some people, the fact that they're so close to the camera, people are sometimes uncomfortable. So having that background in the back allows people to relax their eye when you're speaking close to a camera and gives you a better perception like you're in the room with them. So it makes people more comfortable. So you really nailed it. Well done.
Thank you. But great presentation. I took lots of pointers. Yeah.
And the links that Justin made available in the Q&A at the back end are available on the website where the hosting of the PowerPoint is. You will get those and use them to your advantage.
So I had some, when I was talking about I took some notes down. When we first started Zoom, you know what? If it's happened to me. I thought that I had taken my video camera off, and so I was in a meeting, and I was sitting there, and my daughter was in school, and she's at university, and so I ended up getting sent to my bedroom to do the meeting. So I went to take a selfie, like this was me getting sent to the bedroom. And then somebody in my meeting was like, Shauna, I don't know if you know, but your camera is still on. And I was like, ah, you know. And then I did some workshops, and I was on Remembrance Day. So, and usually I try to do anything I'm going to do online. I try to come here to my office just because of the lighting and everything. Yep. So this time I was in my basement. I think I was doing a presentation to the University of Waterloo. And my husband decides he's going to fix our chair while I'm presenting. So I had to mute it. And I was like, I'm doing a presentation. And then he texts me and he's like, how long you going to be? So, like I said, if it's happened, it's happened to me. Yeah.
Excellent.
So, but you know what? It makes for fun, right? Yeah.
It does.
Elders, I found some elders have really, they've really tried to accustom themselves to, the whole Zoom, Teams, what have you. And if not, they ask, like at Christmas time, we weren't able to gather with my grandma. And so she asked, who was at her home, can you help us so that I want to see, so and so and so and so. And then all of a sudden we got an invite. And so I clicked on, and there was my grandma, and I was like, grandma, but I've also heard, like, at the Can-Do conferences, we've had the elders, talk about how they've, really tried to, get in, with moving with the times, right? Yep. Elder Rick Lightning, he brought up that about, we're, we still got, try to keep our traditional ways, but we still got to, live in that space and that time, and, get to know these, these things that are going on in the world. So I think elders have really, and then text. Yes, when you're doing your presentations, you don't want to have little tiny words. Otherwise, I remember one day I was like, I can't remember who it was, and I didn't realize my video was on, and my face was right up against the screen, and Danielle's like, "Oh, you're really up in personal shot." And I think my screen was below, so you could like see up my nose. Yeah. So text is, it's important, and keeping things exciting. I've been doing some workshops for Norma Wolfchild out at the Blood Tribe, and point form, because if you know your stuff, you don't need to read word for word, right? It's just the keywords and elaborate on it. So I always try to, keep things, keep people, entertained, and, what have you. And I never thought I'd be the kind of person that was like product placement, and
it looks amazing though.
People requesting this of me, and I'm just like, sure, okay. But it's cool. Like, I want to help, especially in these times, right? Especially our artisans. I want to help them out, and that. So thank you for your time. That was, I think this presentation needs to be, again and again, even though it's repetitive, Danielle, maybe in the spring series, bring it on, but maybe early on. Mm-hmm. And just people need to know, like, and then also venturing into like conferences, or you even got these virtual powwows now, okay? And you have virtual round dances, even you have virtual singing contests. So like, there's the Zoom is people are trying to do their part. We sang happy birthday to my dad back in January through Zoom. I'm making some moccasins through Zoom, so there's there's some, we this is a really good. So with that, I just want to remind Norma to fill out the evaluation that'll be sent to you. Your name will be put in at the end of the week for the draw for $400. And our new series starts April 6th, the week of April 6th to 8th for our spring sessions. And, with that being said, thank you guys. And I wish you all the luck, best of luck. And I also, enjoy these days. Like these sunny days are I just love them. I just love them. So I wish you guys all well and safe.
Thank
I
you
do
so
have a
much.
funny story too, on one of the things you were speaking on earlier. So with the Zoom platforms and having the different hosts, because at the beginning of everything, and we were doing these webinars and even meetings, we didn't have it set up so it would run like for a certain time period. If you went over, it would shut off, and we did have that happen a few times, and we'd had to like go back on and resend a link. So we have it figured out now, but at the beginning, yeah, it was a rocky start for sure. If we weren't familiar with Zoom, then yeah.
So we'll do some editing in the next couple hours and see if we can take the.
Sounds good. Okay, thank you guys. Take
See you
care.
guys at 2.
Thank you so much. We'll
Thank
see you
you.
soon.
Yeah.